I still remember that night like it happened yesterday. The dining room table was set perfectly, the way my mom always liked it. She was the kind of woman who lived for appearances, fancy plates, spotless glasses, candles in the center, even if the meal itself was just roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. I sat there, quietly cutting into my food, pretending to listen as my mom went on and on about my sister Rachel. She had that smile on her face, the one she always wore when she was bragging. Rachel just got another promotion, she said, her voice carrying across the table like a proud announcement to the whole neighborhood. She's doing so well at her firm. Honestly, I don't know how she manages it all. Rachel laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. It's nothing, Mom, really. But it was never nothing to my mom. She leaned forward, eyes shining. Don't be modest, sweetheart. You're amazing. Always have been. I forced a smile, stabbing a piece of broccoli with my fork. That was the thing about dinners in our house. It didn't matter what I brought to the table, figuratively or literally. The spotlight was always on Rachel. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And I was just there. It wasn't like I hated Rachel. She was my sister, and I cared about her. But being compared to her every single day of my life had left me with scars I couldn't exactly laugh. Every grade I got in school, every job I tried, every choice I made, somehow, it was never quite enough. Rachel had always been the yardstick, and tonight, sitting at that polished table, nothing felt different. My uncle, who had been sipping his wine quietly, looked over at me. So Ethan, he asked, what have you been up to lately? Before I could even open my mouth, my mom jumped in. Oh, you know Ethan, she said with a chuckle. Still trying to figure things out. Not everyone can be like Rachel. Her words stung, sharp and familiar. I swallowed hard and said nothing, because honestly, what was there to say? This wasn't new. She'd been painting me as the lost cause for years. Rachel glanced at me, her expression unreadable. Maybe she felt sorry. Maybe she didn't. She never really corrected Mom, though. She just let it happen, like it wasn't her problem. I sat there, chewing slowly, pretending it didn't bother me, pretending her words weren't crawling under my skin. But inside, it burned. Every laugh, every casual dismissal, every comparison, like I was some draft version of a person, and Rachel was the final, polished copy. The candles flickered on the table, the room warm with the smell of roasted food, but none of it felt comforting. I felt small in my own house, smaller than I'd felt in years. Ethan, my mom said suddenly, turning her attention back to me. You know, you really should take notes from your sister. She's got her life in order. She paused, then laughed lightly. Well, you'll figure it out someday. Hopefully. Everyone else chuckled politely, like it was just a harmless joke. But to me, it was anything but. It was another reminder of where I stood in her eyes. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I thought about the countless times I'd heard those same kinds of words growing up. Why can't you be more like Rachel? Rachel never struggled with this. Rachel makes me proud. Each phrase etched into my memory like a permanent scar. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam my hands on the table and shout that I wasn't worthless, that I wasn't some failure, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, silent, letting her words hang in the air like smoke. My cousin, sitting across from me, tried to lighten the mood. Hey Ethan, didn't you say you've been working on something new? I nodded, finally managing to speak. Yeah, I've been keeping busy. But before I could explain, my mom waved her hand dismissively. Busy with what? He's always saying he's working on something. Rachel's the one actually making something of herself. The table erupted with soft laughter again. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the heat rising in my face. I glanced at Rachel, hoping she'd step in, maybe defend me just a little. But she stayed quiet, sipping her wine like none of this was happening. That's when it hit me. This was never going to change. No matter what I did, no matter how far I came, in my mom's eyes I'd always be less than Rachel. Always the second choice. Always the failure. I swallowed the bitterness, my fork scraping against the plate. I could hear the clock ticking in the corner, each second dragging out like it was mocking me. Then my mom leaned back in her chair, her voice cutting through the room. "You'll never be successful like your sister, Ethan. But that's okay. Not everyone can be special." The words dropped like a bomb. My chest tightened, my stomach twisted, but I didn't flinch. I just stared at her, the corners of my mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. For a moment, the room was quiet. Everyone seemed to realize she'd crossed some kind of line, though no one dared to call her out. They just looked at their plates, their glasses, anything but me. I felt the weight of her laughter pressing down on me, crushing me. And yet, beneath that weight, something else stirred. A calmness, a strange, steady calm, because I knew something she didn't. Something that would change everything. I didn't argue back. I didn't yell or defend myself. I just picked up my glass of water, took a slow sip and set it down carefully on the table. My silence seemed to unsettle her more than if I'd shouted. She shifted in her chair, trying to fill the quiet. "Well," she said lightly, "at least Rachel makes me proud. That's all a mother can ask for." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the failure she painted me to be. I felt ready. I knew the time was coming when I'd finally say what needed to be said. But not for now. I just sat there, letting her believe her own story, letting her laugh, letting her gloat, completely unaware of the truth I carried with me. And as the laughter at the table faded back into casual conversation, I leaned back in my chair, a quiet fire burning in my chest. She thought she had humiliated me. She thought she had won, but what she didn't know was that the game was only just beginning. Growing up in my house was like living in someone else's shadow. From the time I was old enough to understand words, I heard the same ones over and over again. "Rachel is so smart. Rachel is so talented. Rachel makes me so proud." It wasn't just the things my mom said, it was the way she said them. Her voice would lift when she talked about Rachel, her eyes glowing with pride, and then drop flat whenever she turned to me. I still remember being 10 years old, holding up a drawing I'd worked on for days. I thought it was good, bright colors, little details, my best work yet. I showed it to my mom in the kitchen while she was on the phone. She took one quick glance and said, "That's nice, honey," then went right back to talking about how Rachel had won another spelling bee. I just stood there with my paper in my hands, invisible like the ink was already fading off the page. That was the rhythm of my childhood. Rachel got trophies lined up on her shelf, medals hanging from her doorknob, certificates framed in the hallway. I got polite smiles and quick nods. When I brought home a B on a test, my mom sighed and said, "You need to try harder, Ethan." When Rachel brought home the same grade, she said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Everyone has an off day." The rules were never the same for us. As we got older, it only got worse. Rachel was the star of the family, the one my mom bragged about to neighbors and relatives. She'd say things like, "My Rachel is going to law school. She's destined for greatness." And then almost as an afterthought, she'd add, "Oh, and Ethan, well, he's figuring things." Those words stung more than I ever let on. Figuring things out, like I was some lost kid stumbling around in the dark while Rachel walked a golden path laid out just for her. In high school, I tried everything I could to stand out. I joined the soccer team. I started a band with some friends. I even got decent grades, but no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. If I scored a goal, my mom said, "That's nice." But if Rachel got a good grade on a paper, she baked a cake and told everyone she knew. I learned to stop expecting applause. I learned to stop expecting anything at all. I'll never forget one night, during senior year. I'd been accepted into a small college, not Ivy League, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I walked into the living room, holding the acceptance letter, grinning for the first time in weeks. My mom took it, scanned the page, and smiled thinly. "That's good, Ethan," she said, handing it back. "But did you hear? Rachel just got into Stanford." She said it, like Rachel's acceptance canceled out mine, like my news was nothing but background noise to the real story. I nodded, folded the letter, and went back upstairs to my room, pretending it didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered more than I ever admitted. Every time she brushed me aside, every time she held Rachel up on a pedestal, it cut deeper than I let myself show. I laughed it off in front of friends, shrugged it off when relatives asked, but inside it was like I was carrying stones in my chest. When college came, I decided I'd carve my own path, one away from Rachel. I didn't follow her into law school, or medicine, or any of the fields my mom worshipped. I wanted to build something of my own, something that didn't require her approval. I started dabbling in small businesses, buying and selling online, creating things, testing ideas. Some failed, some barely survived, but little by little, I learned how to keep going, even when no one clapped for me. What my mom never knew was that I got good at it. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't drive flashy cars or post about it on social media. I kept my success quiet. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of fear that if I showed it, she'd find a way to tear it down. Meanwhile, Rachel's perfect life wasn't so perfect. Her shiny apartment in the city, the one mom never stopped bragging about, wasn't really hers to afford. Her promotions barely covered the bills, and more than once, she called me in tears asking for help. I helped her, not because I wanted recognition, but because she was my sister. I covered her rent when she couldn't make. I paid her utility bills, slipped her money when her credit card debt piled up. I told myself I didn't need anyone to know, that it was between me and her. But every time my mom compared us, every time she looked at me with disappointment, and looked at Rachel with pride, the truth gnawed at me. The irony of it all, my mom bragged about Rachel's independence, her success, while the reality was that she was leaning on me, the so-called failure. I kept my silence. I let the story play out the way my mom wanted it to, because it didn't seem worth the fight. I figured, one day, maybe things would change, maybe she'd see me for who I was, without me having to prove it. But that day never came. Instead, the comparisons only got sharper. At family gatherings, Mom would say Rachel just bought new furniture for her place. She has such great taste. Then she'd glance at me, adding, "Ethan, maybe you should learn from your sister." Or she'd say, "Rachel has a real career. What is it that you're doing again, Ethan?" Always in front of people, always with that tone, like she was half joking but not real. I laughed it off on the outside, but inside it was exhausting. It was like carrying a weight I never asked for, one that grew heavier every year. Still, I kept building. Quietly, steadily. My business grew. My income grew. My independence grew. I had my own apartment, my own savings, my own plans. But none of that mattered in my mother's eyes. She didn't want to see it. She only wanted to see Rachel's world, polished and perfect, even if it wasn't real. Sometimes I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like to hear my mom say she was proud of me, just once. Not as an afterthought, not because Rachel wasn't in the room, but because she really meant it. But that moment never came. And after a while, I stopped waiting for it. I stopped needing it, because deep down, I knew the truth. And even if she didn't see it yet, there would come a time when she couldn't ignore it anymore, a time when the mask would slip, and the real story would come to life. And when that moment came, I promised myself I wouldn't have to raise my voice or beg for recognition. The truth would speak for itself. That dinner started out the same way they always did. My mom had been in one of her moods, the kind where she wanted the whole table to hear about how proud she was of Rachel. The smell of garlic bread and roasted chicken filled the room, but for me, it might as well have been smoke choking me out. I already knew where the night was headed before it even began. We were halfway through the meal when my uncle asked me what I'd been working on lately. His voice was casual, polite, like he was just trying to include me, but before I could get a word out, my mom jumped in with that laugh of hers, the sharp one that sounded sweet to everyone else but always cut me down to size. "Oh, Ethan's always busy with something," she said, waving her hand like the thought of me doing anything worth mentioning was ridiculous. "Still trying to figure out life. Not everyone can be like Rachel." The words were followed by a ripple of chuckles around the table. Not loud laughs, more like the kind people give when they don't know what else to do. I sat there with my fork in my hand, my jaw tight, staring at the mashed potatoes on my plate. I wanted to speak, to say something back, but my throat closed up. Rachel shifted in her chair, giving me a quick glance. It wasn't sympathy, not exactly, more like she wanted me to just let it slide, to keep the peace like always. She didn't say anything though. She never. The room filled again with the clink of silverware, but I couldn't shake the heat building in my chest. My mom had done this to me my whole life, but something about tonight made it sting worse. Maybe it was the way she said it in front of everyone, or maybe it was because I was tired. Tired of swallowing my pride. Tired of pretending it didn't matter. Then she said it. The words that would burn themselves into my memory. "You'll never be successful like your sister," she said, almost laughing as the words came out. "But that's okay, not everyone's meant for greatness." The table went quiet for half a second, like even they knew she'd gone too far. But nobody spoke up, nobody defended me. They just sat there in the silence, pretending to chew, pretending to sip their drinks. I stared at her, my fork frozen in midair. My hands felt heavy, like if I dropped the fork it would crash through the table. My mom leaned back in her chair, satisfied with herself, like she'd just told a harmless joke. Rachel gave a small laugh, the nervous kind, but she still didn't speak. She just sat there, sipping her wine, letting Mom's words hang in the air like smoke. My cousin tried to change the subject, asking Rachel about her job, but I barely heard them. My ears were ringing, my chest tight. All I could think about was that sentence, how casually she had thrown it out there, how certain she was that it was true. I wanted to yell. I wanted to slam my fists on the table and tell her she was wrong, that I was more than she ever gave me credit for, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, staring at the flicker of the candles, my mind racing. The thing was, I wasn't even surprised. This was who she was. This was what she did. She'd been telling me in 1,000 different ways my whole life that I'd never measure up. Tonight was just another chapter in the same old story. But this time felt different. The silence that followed her words stretched. My uncle cleared his throat and tried to lighten the mood. "Well, everyone finds their own path, don't they?" he said, forcing a smile. My mom just shrugged, reaching for her wine glass. "Maybe," she said. "But let's be honest. Some people are just born with it." Like Rach, she smiled at her, the kind of smile that said everything. The kind of smile she'd never given me. Something in me hardened right then. I didn't argue. I didn't laugh. I didn't nod along. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the little kid begging for her approval. I didn't feel like the failure she wanted me to be. I felt calm. It was strange, almost unsettling, how calm I felt. Because deep down, I knew something she didn't. And that secret, that truth, gave me a strength she couldn't take away. Rachel shifted again in her chair, and I caught the flicker of unease on her face. She knew I could say something. She knew I held cards. Mom didn't even realize we're on the table, but I stayed quiet, letting the silence do its work. The conversation moved on, but I wasn't really listening. My mom laughed at something Rachel said, bragged about her apartment in the city, her career, her life. All lies wrapped in shiny paper, lies I could unravel with just a few words if I chose to. And as I sat there, I realized something else. My mom thought she'd humiliated me, but really, she'd just set the stage. She'd written the script, without even knowing it. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. No, I was going to wait. I was going to bide my time, and when the moment came, I'd drop the truth in front of her, and everyone else at that table. She thought tonight was her victory, another chance to remind me I'd never be Rachel. But she had no idea the ground she was standing on was about to crumble. So I sat there, my fork finally moving again, cutting through the food I could barely taste. I nodded at the right times, forced a smile when the conversation called for it. On the surface, I looked calm, maybe even defeated, but inside I was steadying myself. Inside I was already planning the moment I would finally speak, the moment where the laughter would stop, the smug smiles would fade, and my mom would see me, not the version she made up in her head, but the truth. And that moment was closer than she thought. I don't know what it was that made me finally open my mouth that night. Maybe it was the way my mom leaned back in her chair after tearing me down, sipping her wine like she'd just won some game. Maybe it was the way Rachel avoided my eyes, like she was praying I'd stay silent. Or maybe it was just that I was tired of carrying the truth on my shoulders while everyone around me believed the story my mom had written. Whatever it was, something in me shifted. The calm I'd been holding onto settled deeper, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small at that table. I felt steady. I set down my fork, the sound of metal against porcelain louder than I expected in the quiet room. Everyone glanced at me, probably thinking I was going to excuse myself or make some awkward joke to brush off what my mom had just said. But I didn't. I looked right at her. "Mom," I said slowly, my voice even. "You really think Rachel's got it all figured out, don't you?" She gave me that same smile she always gave, the one that said she knew better. "Of course she does, Ethan. Look at her. She's built a real life for herself, a life to be proud of." Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mom," she started, but I cut her off. "Funny thing," I said, leaning back a little. "Appearances can be deceiving." The table went quiet again. My uncle raised an eyebrow. My cousin glanced back and forth between us like he'd just realized the air was about to get heavier. My mom chuckled, brushing me off. "Oh, here we go," she said. "Ethan, don't be bitter. It's not Rachel's fault you're still figuring things out." That was it. That was the moment. I reached down beside my chair and pulled out a plain folder I'd brought with me. I hadn't planned on using it, not unless she pushed me far enough. But of course, she did. She always did. I placed it on the table and slid it forward, right into the candlelight. "You want to know the truth?" I asked quietly. "Here it." My mom frowned, confused, as she looked at the folder. "What is this?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I flipped it open, pulling out the stack of papers inside. Receipts, bank transfers, copies of rent payments, utility. Each one had my name on it, each one tied to Rachel's address. I spread them out across the table like cards in a game. Rachel's face drained of color. "Ethan, don't," she whispered, but I didn't stop. "These," I said, tapping the papers with my finger, "are payment, rent checks, utility bills, credit card transfers, all from me, for Rachel." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Nobody spoke. Forks froze midair. Glasses stopped halfway to mouths. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I kept my eyes on my mom. "While you've been sitting here telling me I'll never be successful like her, I've been the one keeping her apartment from getting locked, keeping her lights on, making sure she could breathe. You want to talk about greatness? You've been bragging about her independence, her success. But the truth is, she wouldn't have that life if I wasn't holding it up." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at her plate, her shoulders tight, but she didn't deny it. She couldn't. My mom blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what I was saying. That's not true," she stammered. I slid one of the receipts across the table to her. "Look at it. My name. My bank account. Her landlord's address. You think I'm making this up?" She picked it up with shaky hands, scanning the paper. I could see the confusion turn to disbelief, and then to something else. Fear. Fear that the picture-perfect story she'd been telling herself and everyone else was cracking right in front of her. This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "It makes perfect sense," I said, my voice steady. "You've spent years tearing me down, telling me I'd never measure up, all while I was the one keeping your perfect daughter from drowning. You mocked me at this table tonight like I was not." The room went dead silent after Rachel stormed out. The sound of the front door slamming still echoed in my ears, rattling through the walls of the house. For a moment, it felt like everything around me had frozen. The flickering candles, the clink of ice melting in a glass, even the ticking clock on the wall. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, though I didn't look up right away. I sat there, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my chest steady. My mom still had that one receipt pinched between her fingers, her knuckles white like she was afraid to let it go. Her eyes darted between the paper and me, searching for some kind of explanation that would make this all disappear. "Ethan," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. I looked at her, not with anger, not with the desperate need for approval that had ruled me for so long, but with something simpler, calm. The truth had already been spoken. There was nothing else I needed to add. The silence stretched longer. My uncle cleared his throat and set his glass down, the sound almost too loud in the stillness. He glanced at me, then at my mom, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just leaned back and shook his head slowly, as if the whole picture had finally started to click for him. My cousin, wide-eyed, whispered under his breath, "No way." He stared at the stack of receipts like they were evidence from a crime scene. But my mom, she just sat there, frozen in place. Her face was pale, her lips trembling like she wanted to deny it, but couldn't. Her perfect little story, the one she'd told herself and everyone else for years, had just shattered in the middle of her dining room. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me. My voice was quiet when I finally spoke. "You always said Rachel was the strong one, the one who made you proud. But tell me, Mom, how strong is someone who can't even keep a roof over her head without help?" She flinched, her shoulders tensing, but she didn't answer. I shook my head slowly, my eyes never leaving hers. "You laughed at me tonight. You said I'd never be successful, but while you were laughing, I was the one making sure Rachel didn't drown. And the worst part is, you never even bothered to look. You were so busy praising her, you never stopped to ask what I was actually doing." Her hand trembled, the receipt rattling slightly in her grip. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Exactly," I said, my voice sharp but steady. "You didn't know, because you never cared to know. You only cared about the version of the story that made you look good. The golden daughter, the failure son. It was easy for you that way." My uncle sighed heavily, breaking the tension for just a sec. "Linda," he said softly, "maybe it's time you admit you were wrong." Her eyes flicked toward him, full of shame, before snapping back to me. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, like the weight of her own words had finally collapsed on her shoulder. I stood then, slowly, pushing my chair back from the table. The scraping sound against the hardwood floor echoed through the silence, sharp and final. Everyone's eyes followed me, but I kept my focus on her. "I'm done being your punchline," I said. "I'm done sitting here while you tear me down to lift Rachel up. You wanted to humiliate me tonight. Instead, you exposed yourself." Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but no sound came out. I reached for my glass of water, took one last sip, and set it down carefully. "You asked why I'm not like Rachel. The truth is, I never wanted to be. I wanted to be me, and I am. I've built something real, something you never cared to see. And now, you don't get to laugh at me anymore." The weight of my words seemed to press into the walls themselves. My mom's face crumpled, her hand covering her mouth, tears threatening to spill. I'd never seen her cry before, not once in my whole life, but in that moment, she looked broken. I didn't stay to watch her fall apart. I gathered the folder, tucked it under my arm, and straightened my shoulder. The room was still heavy with silence, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt clean, like a storm had finally passed. As I walked toward the hallway, my cousin whispered, "Damn," under his breath, but I didn't turn around. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, steady and slow. Behind me, I heard my mom's quiet sob, muffled against her hand. I heard my uncle let out another long sigh. I heard nothing from Rachel. She was already gone, probably too ashamed to face anyone. When I reached the door, I stopped for a second, my hand resting on the knob. I didn't look back, but I spoke one last time. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "You don't have to be proud of me, Mom. Not anymore. I don't need it, but you'll never forget tonight." You'll never forget who it was that kept everything standing while you looked the other way. And with that, I opened the door. The cool night air rushed in, washing over me like freedom. I stepped outside, the sound of the door closing behind me, final like a chapter slamming shut. The silence I left behind was louder than any argument I could have made. Inside, they would sit with the truth, and me. I walked away lighter than I'd ever felt before. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the shadow. I didn't feel like the failure. I felt like myself, unapologetic, unshaken, and finally free.